The moral authority of the state is death.
You are listening to And If Love Remains, a unique show spotlighting people, ideas, science, culture, and art. Your host, Mike Lovett.
Yes, Rachel, this is indeed Mike Levitt, and you are in fact listening to And If Love Remains. And we have a 3 or 4 time guest on the show again, just a good friend of the program, good friend of mine, and I'm always excited to have Mike Maharrey on the program. He's a great guy. He does great work with the 10th Amendment Center, with Shift Gold, and his own projects, the Godarchy podcast, and other things that I think we'll have some fun talking about. But mostly I just like having my friends on the show. So welcome back, man.
Thanks for having me, man. It's always good to have a couple of mics on a show, right?
We can all have a mic drop together. It's great.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know if I want to have a mic drop, because that would imply that I fell out of my chair or something. So which is not out of the realm of possibility.
Right. That might happen. Yes. We were just discussing how the last couple of years anything can happen, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we learned that in the COVID era, right?
Oh man. Hey, have you been following any of the stuff that's going on? I'm just randomly checking. Have you followed any of the stuff that's going on, like in China, with the protests or anything like that?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, not really any more than what's on the mainstream news.
Yeah.
I initially heard that there were protests breaking out, and I said something to my wife, not really knowing any context. I said, I bet they're fed up with being locked down for the COVID thing. And sure enough, that seems to be the driver of what's going on. And I mean, you know, we lived through it here in the United States, and I guess depending on what state you're in, there was various levels of draconianness to the lockdowns and whatnot. But we've not endured anything like what they've had to put up with in China for now. Going on 3 years. Where they literally lock people into their apartments and into their houses and stuff. And human beings will only take so much before they're like, wait a minute, this is not sustainable. And I think I read today that the World Cup is actually kind of was a wake-up call for a lot of folks, because they remember all of the draconian things that were in place, and masking and all of this stuff for the Olympics. Right. And then they're looking at this World Cup and nobody's wearing masks and everybody's just acting like it's perfectly normal. And I think that a lot of people saw that and like, wait a minute, what the heck's going on here? So very interesting. Well, I'd like to be optimistic, but the Chinese government seems to be pretty good at quelling these types of uprisings. So
yeah, they really do. And unfortunately there's enough support in the West that you're not going to see a lot of reporting about it,
right?
Unfortunately, but I think you're right that, and it does seem to be pretty. And maybe this is how protests work. I don't know, but it seems to be pretty focused. They're not trying to like overthrow the CCP or anything like that,
right.
But they're just saying like, you got to let us out. Like,
let me out of my house. Yeah,
right. Well, there's people that have been staying in wet markets for months at a time. It's insane the things that's going on there.
Yeah, it's crazy. And, it's, you have to wonder, I think about myself, I will be much less, I think back to the early days of the pandemic, and when we kind of, nobody knew what was going on. Right. And we were actually traveling when the very first restrictions started going into effect. We were up in Tennessee and Kentucky at the time. And, there was that sense of, I don't really know, and kind of questioning, right. And, maybe they're right. Maybe we should. I think people are going to be a lot less willing the next thing that comes around to say, okay, I'm just going to blindly go along. I mean, a lot of people will, obviously. We see that. I mean, I still see people driving around with masks on in their car, but for me, myself, I'm going to be much more aggressive in resisting that kind of stuff. If
I think
it comes
so.
Back around again.
I hope there's enough people that have a little bit of the boy that cried wolf syndrome, where they're just like, no, we're not going to just believe the experts because they say,
Yeah.
you know, that was such, I think, a wake up call for a lot of people. And what's interesting to me is I see, I call them honest hearts, and they're guys that I don't agree with on a lot of stuff, and they may be atheists, they may be even leftists, but they're guys like Brett Weinstein and guys like that but they're honest in the sense that they're just like, this is insane, and what we're seeing is science being decimated, the whole idea of truth being just thrown out the window, and we're just expected to follow along with whatever the guy. I love what Brett says. He says zero is a magical number, because if you can eliminate all other possibilities, then the only one is the one that I present to you.
Yeah, exactly.
So
Yeah, it's just it's interesting, and by the time they got around to the vaccines, I had gotten pretty adamant. It's like, I'm not doing this.
yeah,
And now, looking at, I mean, even what they're admitting, I don't regret that decision at all. So
yeah. No, I think there's a lot of man, it just felt like we were all experimenting on a lot of different levels, both psychologically with this vaccine. Like, there's a lot of experiments that felt like that were going on, and we were the guinea pigs.
yeah, for sure.
So, well, hey man, first of all, you were just mentioning to me, like, you're wearing your Ramones t-shirt,
Yeah.
and I know you're a big music fan. So we gotta get some of this stuff. So listeners, you guys know that I do a lot of music on my channel. So we got to talk a little music here. Talk to me about like what are some of your music loves, man?
So I'm an '80s kid, and
Yeah,
so if you go and get in my car, there's about a 90% chance that it will be on the channel they call First Wave, which is new wave, post punk.
yeah,
So that kind of thing. So we're talking Depeche Mode, The Cure, New Order, of course the Ramones, Sex Pistols, getting into the kind of the punk side of it, the Smiths, uh, and then more of the poppy stuff. Duran Duran, ABC. Love all of that stuff. That's really kind of my wheelhouse. Um, but as a musician, I really love all kinds of music and can appreciate various different styles. Thing I've kind of gotten into a lot lately, especially working, is kind of deep house.
yeah,
The little bit of lyrical content, but mostly just music, the four on the floor beat. In some ways, it's pretty simple, but the channel on Sirius XM, they call it chill, so it is perfect for working because it kind of plays in the background of your head. Um, so I've been
yeah.
listening to a lot of
It's
that.
kind of like ambient with a beat,
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of interesting because I started when I started listening to it, then I started kind of researching, because I think the evolution of various musical styles is fascinating. How things, um, music's so reactionary. So you get the punk was kind of the snap back against disco, and you get
Yeah,
all of this evolution, and the whole house thing was interesting. It was almost something that was built around the technology of the time, with these certain drum machines that all these guys started using, and they could make this music in their house. That's the term house music, and it's interesting as you kind of delve into it. And as far as like working on music, uh, that's kind of the direction that I'm wanting to go in terms of doing some writing and stuff. But you
oh,
know how it
fun.
goes. The
Well, I
time,
know
the time
I
is the
do.
hard part.
I do. I know you play the sax, but you also, and I've seen some of the stuff that you put out that you've written. It's really good stuff. So I'm excited to see, when you get around to it. I'd love to be a part of, here's some of that stuff.
Yeah, for sure. I've got a project in my head, and I've told my wife the other day, I've just had a hard time like pulling the trigger. Part of it just being so busy with work and stuff, and then when it gets down to some downtime, I don't have the mental energy to do something else that requires mental energy. So I find
Right.
myself watching football teams lose.
What is the deal with Tom Brady?
Oh, I don't know.
Is he just getting old?
His arm's fine. I think the biggest problem, and I'm sure people don't really want to get into a whole. I could talk sports all day too, but
Well, me too. I'm a big
with
sports
the
guy.
with the Bucks, I think the biggest problem is the offensive line, and
Yeah.
it's they lost a couple of key pieces, and then their All Pro center was injured in training camp, so he's been gone. And so it's a wholly rebuilt, pieced together with duct tape and baling twine offensive line, and Brady doesn't trust it. And you can see that he's not taking the time to let the plays downfield develop. I think he's rushing a lot of times, so you're seeing some of those longer throws being just a little bit off, and they're just dumping down. And then they're trying to, Todd Bowles wants to do the running game, so they're trying to do that, and they don't have the offensive line for it. So it's just
That's a rough.
It's bad.
I will say, living here in Arizona, Bruce Arians definitely knows how to make an exit. He knows the right time.
Yes, he does. Well, and the whole thing with that was that when Brady came back, I think he was going to coach this year with Brady gone.
Yeah.
But I think when Brady came back, I think he wanted to open the door for Todd Bowles. He wanted him to get that head coaching position. He thought this would be a setup for success.
Right.
Apparently not. So.
Yeah, no, it's wild. And it's funny, like these quarterbacks, like Tom Brady, and I'm thinking about Aaron Rodgers too.
Rodgers,
like both of those guys, like I don't see there's, as you mentioned, like he still's got the arm, and I think Aaron Rodgers still has a great arm. He still can throw. Yeah. It really is. It matters so much to the team around. Like, what's the difference between Aaron Rodgers and Patrick Mahomes? Well, the Chiefs.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And then you also have to consider there is a psychological aspect to sports that I think people who haven't played at a high level probably don't really understand. But all of the stuff that's been going on in Brady's personal life, going through a divorce and the business issues and whatnot, to some degree you can put that aside, but it impacts things. It just does. And
yeah,
I'm sure that there's a little bit of a focus difference with Brady.
Well, there has to be.
I mean, there has to be. That's just it's human nature.
Yeah, I mean, you could say, and even by like saying it's your escape or it's your way to not think about it, that in itself means that you're thinking about it.
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
It's crazy. I was going to ask you on the music stuff. Do you have you gotten into any kind of the synthwave kind of stuff?
Not really. I mean, my thing is I tend to be locked in the past, right? And I guess at a certain age that happens to all of us.
Yeah.
So I always gravitate back to the 80s.
Yeah.
So
well, that's
a lot of new stuff. I don't even know what's out there.
I will say the thing I like about the synthwave kind of movement, and I totally recommend checking it out, is that they're taking the old stuff and then they're kind of like turning it into it's kind of like they're repackaging it in a real grungy sound. They're putting it through tape machines and different things like that, and then stretching it out and kind of doing weird stuff. So it gets to be like kind of, it's like 80s through a funny house.
Oh yeah, cool. I'll have to check that out for sure then.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. All right, so I, with all that being said,
everybody's tuned out now.
That's right.
Like, what is this show?
Back in, right? Well, this is what the show is. Anybody who looks at my list of titles goes, "What is this show?" So yeah, I want to talk a little bit about your Godarchy podcast. I'm fascinated by it. I think it's a wonderful project. I've really enjoyed listening to the episodes, and it looks like I know you just kind of came out with Godarchy podcast 3.0. First of all, what does that mean? What is where are you headed there?
Well, it's kind of
season 3.
It's almost a joke because when I started the podcast and did almost 80 episodes. And then my mom was diagnosed with cancer. And when she started to go downhill, obviously a lot of things were set aside. And so I did not do the podcast for almost a year. And once we not only did my mom pass away, we had to deal with her estate. And then we bought a house and we renovated said house and we moved. So just a lot of stuff personally going on. So once things started to settle, I decided, I wanted to relaunch Godarchy. And honestly put a lot of thought into it. It was like, do I really want to put this on my plate? It's not like I'm making a lot of money off of it, or it's just a project of passion more than anything. And it just felt like, this is something that I should continue. So I did the reboot, and that was Godarchy 2.0. And I think we only did 8 episodes, and the opportunity came up to join and partner up with the Libertarian Christian Institute, which you can find over at libertarianchristians.com. And they were in the process of creating the Christians for Liberty Network, which is the vision is to have a whole lot of shows that are all focused on liberty and Christian faith,
Okay.
in various, various iterations. And so they asked me if I'd be interested in joining their network, and we just actually did that the beginning of this month. First episode on the network was on November 19th. So that's Godarchy 3.0. Honestly, in terms of content, it's not any different. I mean,
Yeah.
you can mix and match, but it was just kind of a joke because I rebooted it once, and then once we decided to launch the network, Doug Stewart, who's the CEO over at Libertarian Christian Institute, he thought it'd be funny to call it 3.0. So that's
That's
what we
great.
did.
Well, congratulations on a partnership. That sounds exciting, and I really do think it's an important aspect. Within libertarian circles, the freedom movement, I think that the Christian or the religious anarchist or freedomists out there, minimalists, however you want to say it, those who believe in lowering government but have it with a Christian outlook is, I won't say missing, but I think it's lacking in a major way.
And that's why I was really excited to partner with Libertarian Christian Institute, because they are, by far kind of the leading voice in the quote unquote liberty movement for Christians. And, it's a pretty big tent. You'll find minarchists and anarchists, and also a lot of theological perspectives. There's actually a one of the podcasts on the network is the Reformed Libertarian Christian podcast, so it comes at it
Okay.
from a Reformed theological perspective. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of sub niches within the broader scope, but I think it's important to kind of have a unified voice that, hey, we're all talking about how does liberty and these ideas from a political standpoint, how do they mesh with Christian faith? And LCI is doing a great job at that, and so I'm just excited to be part of a bigger piece of work that I think is really important. As you said, it's kind of underrepresented, and I think it's important. I think it's important both for libertarians who are Christians to understand that their worldview needs to reflect their faith.
Yeah.
And then on the other side of it, I think it's really important for the church to consider some things that are outside of the status quo, and that maybe trying to grasp secular political control and somehow impose Christianity or a Christian worldview. Maybe that's not the best path to take from both a political philosophy standpoint and
Right.
from a theological standpoint. So,
I
for
think,
me, it's almost I almost, my passion isn't as much to reach libertarians, is to reach the broader church with these
yeah.
ideas of liberty.
Well, and I think that's an important thing, because I don't think you can find a more subversive work ever created than the Bible.
Right.
And I think if read properly, and this is my own personal feelings, but I and the way I read the Bible, the way I interpret the things, and the way the Spirit speaks to me, like, I think ultimately God is a voluntarist. I mean,
Yeah.
I think ultimately, like, he's going to let us do what we want to do and form the relationships that we want to form, whether that be a king. Sorry, Israel, you screwed the pooch on that one.
Yes.
And the rest of us have suffered ever since. Or if it's, or if we're going to live in a community like the Amish, or if we're going to live in dare I say Zion, like these things are things that we get to decide.
Right. Yeah, and I think the other aspect of that is that the kingdom of God is a kingdom.
Right.
They call it the kingdom of God for a reason, and the gospel writers emphasize that idea. We are our own nation. We are our own people, and we are, talks. Even Paul puts it in this term. He talks about us as ambassadors for our kingdom. We're strangers in a strange land. We're living in a foreign country. You hear all of these kind of analogies. And I think that's very literally true. And the kingdom of God is separate and distinct from the kingdom of the United States or the kingdom of China or the kingdom of whatever worldly nation you want to plug in there. Our value systems are different. The way we do things are different. Our king is different. He establishes kingdom in a totally different way. And so I want Christians to live within their kingdom ethic and focus on that instead of trying to make the other kingdoms be something that they're not.
Oh,
And
that's wise. Yeah.
yeah, so it's to me is I'm not a separatist, so to speak. I'm not one of these people that thinks you just pull into your religious group and you ignore the world around you. But I do believe that we shouldn't be entangled in the in other kingdoms' wars and
Yeah.
in the way the other kingdoms do things. And really, for me, that's the real focus of a lot of the messaging that you'll hear. Not so much on the Godarchy podcast, because that just depends on who I'm interviewing. But if you go to godarchy.org and read a lot of the articles that I've written over the years, I focus a lot on the fact that the ethic of the world, the kingdoms of the world, are based on violence, force, and coercion. And there's a theologian, William Stringfellow, that I'm very fond of and have been heavily influenced by. And he, in one of his books, he made the statement that the moral authority of the state is death. And when you think about it, it's true. Everything that the state does ultimately is predicated on death. It is the threat of, if you don't do what we tell you to do, we will kill you.
Mm-hmm.
Every law has that implicit threat behind it. Even, and people say, no, you're using too much hyperbole. Or think about it. Think about something as mundane as a seatbelt law, right? If I don't wear my seatbelt, I can get pulled over by a cop who's carrying a gun, incidentally. And if he catches me, he can write me a ticket, right?
Right.
If I don't pay the ticket, my driver's license gets suspended. If I continue to drive with my driver's license suspended, I will be subject to being physically restrained and arrested and put in a cage. And if I resist that physical action, I will be killed. So even that seatbelt law, when you get down to, you follow it out to its logical conclusion, it is enforced at the barrel of a gun. And that's not Jesus. Jesus doesn't enforce his kingdom at gunpoint. He doesn't use violence, force, and coercion. He uses submission and humility. And, he didn't come down off the cross and start shooting lightning bolts at Roman soldiers. He hung on that cross and died, and he overcame the power of death by actually dying and then raising back to life. It's a totally different ethic.
And it's staring us right in the face. And even the things that we read, like I think about the history of the Gospels. And, if we talk about what the Gospels are, I mean, it's a style of writing. It's like a novel. And historically the Gospels were the Caesar saying, look at all the kingdoms that we've taken over. It's like the news of the day. Hey, see what your tax dollars at work, man. We are the greatest. Hail Caesar.
Right.
And so here comes this strange book like the Gospel of the Gospel of Luke, and it says, look at the great things that God has done. Oh, and he came as a baby.
Yeah. Yeah, it's totally
it's
profound.
so subversive.
It is subversive. And that's, I never really understood this. I grew up in kind of your pretty conservative evangelical circles. And I never understood the political subversiveness of the gospel and of Jesus and of that whole story. And when you understand the context of the times and what the Jewish people were looking for, what their conception of a Messiah was, a lot of things start to fall into place. They believed that the Messiah was going to be like another David, and he was going to come in armor with a giant sword, and he was going to crush the Roman Empire, and he was going to reestablish Israel to its worldly greatness.
Because that's what
That's what
heroes
they,
do.
yeah, exactly. And that's what they expected. And everything that Jesus did was like, they were expecting, they were like, oh, here's the Messiah, and this Jesus, he's going to come in here and kick some rear, and then he comes riding in on a donkey. That symbolism is just so powerful because he's showing that he's a different kind of king.
Mm-hmm.
And even you go to the the whole trade off between Jesus and Barabbas. Most scholars think that Barabbas was probably a zealot, that he was an insurrectionist. That the reason that he had been imprisoned by the Romans was because he was instigating some type of rebellion, which was, the zealots were a large contingent of the Jewish people at that time. They were ready to try to throw off this Roman rule with violence. And Barabbas was an insurrectionist. And there's almost this choice. Do you want this Jesus Messiah who's talking about love your enemies and the meek shall inherit the earth and all of these things? Or do you want Barabbas, the insurrectionist? And the people are like, oh, we want Barabbas. They chose the way of the sword. And Jesus told Peter in the garden, put your sword away. So it's a whole different ethic. And I don't think people really grasp that because we don't learn the gospels in that context. We learn it's more of a focus on our personal salvation, which of course is important.
Well, and then the ultimate, like, do your worst, Caesar, and Caesar did his worst, and look what happened. Christ rose from the dead, and it's as if we look at the greatest human ever and just says, you're nothing. You are literally nothing because you did your worst, and here I am. I'm more powerful. I'm more powerful than you could ever imagine, says Obi-Wan.
I've been studying the book of Matthew for like 3 years.
Yeah.
I've got a really in-depth commentary. So it's like, 4 verses at a time, and I spend a week in those 4 verses. So that's why it's been 3 years. But I'm at the very end now. So I've just have been reading and studying the accounts of the women coming to the tomb and the angels sitting on the rock. And in Matthew, it's the only of the 4 gospels, it's the only one that talks about the guard. And there's this little piece of irony in there I had never caught before. It talks about that when the angel rolled the stone away, the soldiers were terrified and they became like dead men. And there's this irony there. The Roman soldiers, this symbol of worldly power, they're like dead men, but Jesus is not in his tomb anymore. He's alive. And there's that contrast there. And I think that irony is intentional.
Oh, that's powerful. Cool. Yeah, that's good stuff. Man, and I could talk about this kind of doctrinal stuff so much, but I also want to go back to kind of your goals. I love what you're doing with the podcast and trying to reach out to Christians, because I also think there's a lost role that the church as the body of Christ has in civil society.
Yeah.
And I say completely lost. And that is the role of being that counterbalance to the government, that we don't even recognize anymore. Like we saw, COVID was such a clear example of every church, every major religion, every church pretty much just submitting and saying, okay, we're going to close our doors just because the government says. And I think there has to be a role, for a powerful role for the church just to be a thwart against government power that isn't there right now. And that has to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. When I first started doing Godarchy, so I actually started the website back in 2016, and the website existed for several years before I started the podcast. And it was kind of one of those things, I was drug into it kicking and screaming. It's like I had this kind of vision that I needed to start this website that was for Christian anarchist voluntarists, and also another big aspect of that was I want to be an anti-war voice in the church, which is also something that's lacking. And I didn't want to do it. It's like, just what I need is another project, right? And I just felt like I had to do it. It was one of those things I had to do. So I started doing this, and now I've completely lost my train of thought of where I was going with that.
Well, I was mentioning the role of the church,
yeah,
as a thwart.
So, yeah. Oh, yeah, okay, yeah, now I remember. So when started into this, I'm not a theologian. Don't claim to be one. I'm relatively well read. I'm probably, knowledgeable for a layperson, but I've never studied Greek. I've never taken any theology classes or anything like that. My theology is probably a mess, according to somebody who's a theological purist. But I did want to learn. So I started reading as much as I could about the early church, the church as it was growing up, especially as it was interacting with Rome prior to Constantine. So the era of the persecution and those kind of things. And I remember one story, and I say story, it's a historical narrative, but we'll call it a story. Um, there was a pretty significant pandemic, and I can't remember what they think it was. I want to say it. They think it might have been smallpox, or might have been plague. One of those,
Big time.
big
Yeah.
time things that swept through ancient cultures, and everybody was afraid. And the people that were actually going into and caring, like when somebody got sick, they would just leave them there because they didn't want to be near them because didn't want to get it. And it was the Christians that were actually going into these people's homes and caring for the sick. And of course, some of them got it and died, and some of them didn't. But um, that's the kind of when you started talking about that kind of counterculture, that's the first thing that came to mind. Not buying into the narrative of the fear, but doing what God calls us to do, to love the people around us. And that was a powerful witness. And it was one of the things that helped grow the church in those early days, because, you know, at that time, it was costly to be a Christian. It
For
was,
sure.
you had to renounce so much of what Roman society considered important. And you imagine today, if you took a vow as a Christian, I'm not going to say the pledge, and I'm not going to stand up for the Star Spangled Banner, and I'm not going to vote, and I'm not going to do all of these things that everybody tells you that civic society, that you must do these to be a good citizen.
Right.
Christians weren't good citizens in that sense. They wouldn't offer the offerings to the Roman gods, and people have to understand that to the Romans, the gods, that wasn't just a religious thing. That was a part of Roman civil society. They believed that they didn't do the right things by the gods, that it would wreck the society. So if you have people saying, "Well, we're not going to go to the temple of Apollo today," that was, people are like, "Oh, you're going to bring the wrath of Apollo down on Rome." So the Christians were very much countercultural in that way, and today, honestly, I was talking to the pastor of my church not too long ago, and he said, "I think we're heading for a time when it's going to be hard to be a Christian."
Yeah.
And to really be a Christian, I mean, you can always do the watered down thing, and I'm spiritual but not religious, or that kind of stuff that people want to
Well,
throw
I
around.
think that's a misnomer. I think a lot of people think Christianity is supposed to be a private deal, and if you read the Bible, it is. I mean, it is not. It is supposed to be a public and an outward showing of your faith.
Yeah, and it's a participatory sport. You
Yeah.
need to be surrounded by other believers. You need the body needs to work together, and um, one of my great frustrations is I feel like the church, and when I say that, I'm talking kind of church universal. Um, I feel like the impetus, at least here in the United States, is instead of the church doing the things that it's called to do, to lead the way on, moral purity, to care for the poor, to care for the sick, the widows, to be the peacemakers in the society. Instead of doing that, I think most people want to vote for the right politician so the government will do it for them.
Yes.
And
On both sides of the aisle, by the way.
oh, absolutely, yeah. This is not this is not a left, right, blue, red paradigm kind of thing. This is in general, and I mean, let's be honest, it's kind of lazy. It's like, I'll give you an example. This will rattle some feathers. When you talk about fighting racism, it's like they want to create some kind of political program to stop racism, and this would be a lot of people on the left. We're going to have this political agenda to fix racism. And on the right, you have the backlash against that. So, it does work on both sides of the aisle. But the fact of the matter is, it's your job to fix racism. If you're really concerned about the plight of a minority community, go into that minority community, interact with those people. There's way too many white middle class people out there running around spouting off about racism who have absolutely no interaction with African American people or Hispanic people or the people they say they're championing, because they're not going to go into those neighborhoods.
Right.
No, that's how you fix racism. You go into those neighborhoods and you build trust and you build relationships and you help people in those areas.
And by the way, no government program can make that happen. Zero.
Absolutely. In fact, the government programs, that just creates the divisiveness, because you get the backlash on the other side of the people on the right. They understandably feel put upon when they're criticized for not being woke enough, or for not being you know non-racist, or when they're called white supremacists and all these stupid things that are bandied about. So there's a backlash from the other side that, I mean, I hate to say it, but it turns into its own kind of little racism thing.
Yeah.
And it makes them resistant, because they're automatically with their, and it's also counterproductive, and it's
Well, and
frustrating.
that's why, the ultimate truth and the ultimate way we fix this, and this is why I'm convinced, like, we can do it on a personal level, on a local level, but ultimately it's going to take Jesus to fix, come quick, Jesus, because the ultimate answer is forgiveness. And that doesn't happen outside of a, religious community, outside of a religious experience
Mhm.
that each one has to have in their own hearts.
Amen. And you're right. And I think the other aspect of that is that we can reflect that kind of healing and that kind of relationship in the church, because the gospel is very clear. There is no Greek, there is no Jew, there is no male, there is no female, there is no black, there's no white. We are all one in Christ. We are all brothers and sisters in Christ. And when you get a congregation together that lives that out, it is a freaking powerful thing. I was very privileged when we lived up in Northeast Florida. Was a member of a church that was historically the Black Methodist Church. This is up on Amelia Island, Fernandina Beach, which is on the Florida-Georgia border. And the church originally was basically where the slaves worshipped. And so that's kind of the tradition and history. And it's interesting because literally 2 blocks away is the White Methodist Church.
Right.
Over the years, Trinity, the church that we went to, has become a mixed congregation. It's probably 60-40 now, probably 60% white, 40% African American.
Well,
But
Amelia Island's probably gotten more affluent, that's kind of.
absolutely. But I'll tell you what, the first time that my wife and I went in this church, I have never felt more welcomed and loved in a church in my life. And it was small. I mean, there's only like 30 people in there. Every single person that was in that church came up and talked to us. People were giving us hugs. Like, I don't know you. It's kind of creepy for somebody that's a little bit of a introvert. But we just loved that church, and it was so cool because you saw that kind of healing. Nobody paid attention to the racial elements. It wasn't something that we wasn't preached about. It just was a natural harmony of people who were all going in the same direction to seek Jesus. And it's really cool. And I think that's how you get racial healing on both
Yeah.
sides, because there's some things in the Black community that needs to be fixed as well. It's not all the racism of the whites, which certainly have contributed to the problems over the years. There's problems in the African American community too. But it's powerful when you bring people together under the banner of Christ and you're pushing for something greater than yourself and your own political agenda and all of these things. It's amazing the kind of love and kind of things that happen. And it's amazing. This little church, it raised like $100,000 with a congregation that was never more than 50 on a Sunday morning. Raised all this money to do the building's over 100 years old, so there's a lot of repairs that needed to be done and stuff. And the community saw what was going on and they got interested. It was a really neat experience. I missed
Be a
that
light
church.
unto the world, right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
That's fantastic. That's really great. Um, I wanted to ask you. It sounds to me like you would probably have considered yourself a Christian before an anarchist.
Oh yeah.
And so, talk to me about that kind of, because I think there's a lot of people, both in and outside of the church, that would see the contradiction between we talked about a kingdom of heaven, and having and then calling oneself a voluntarist or an anarchist. What talk about that evolution in your mind?
Yeah. So just for broader background, and I probably talked about this before on the show. Um, I came from the political right. I was your pretty standard, uh, I guess what you would probably call religious right in the 80s and 90s. Um, Predictably Republican.
Hmm.
Love my Rush Limbaugh.
Right.
So that's where I came from. Very, very neocon, very pro-military, pro-war. We gotta bomb all these bad people to make them better people or something.
Right.
So that's where I came from, and so it's kind of interesting if you going back and looking at my own personal evolution. I went through about 4 or 5 years that I walked away from my faith in my early 30s, and so I was going through this political evolution where I was becoming more and more libertarian, and that primarily had to do with me getting involved with the 10th Amendment Center, starting to really study the Constitution, what America was supposed to look like in terms of a decentralized political system. So I started there, and there's the old joke: what's the difference between an anarchist and a minarchist? About 6 months. For me, it was a couple of years, but there definitely was that evolution. But I was also going through a spiritual rebirth at the same time, which in a way were kind of separate. I'm becoming more and more politically libertarian because I believe that if you're going to have government, it needs to be decentralized. It needs to be checked. The power needs to be in the hands of the people, not in the hands of the government and the politicians themselves. Meanwhile, I'm really starting to come back to my faith. And I guess for me, there came a point where it's like, okay. And I was reading a little bit at this point from Celtic Christianity, so like Irish, Scottish, Gaelic, and going back to that period when St. Patrick was evangelizing Ireland. And Celtic Christianity has a very holistic worldview, because it came out of a very pagan, pantheistic uh, uh, religion worldview that viewed nature as kind of God, right? And so that got interwoven into their Christian theology. So they see God in a lot of things that maybe the 21st century American doesn't. They look at a tree and they see God. They look at the sun and they see God as, and it's the whole idea that God is the creator of all, so He's in all, and weaving His way through everything in this world. And so, kind of thinking about that, it's like that's true. And the Jewish religion was very much like that too. A very holistic view that everything in some sense is holy because it all comes from God. And I started to think, I've got this political view and I'm a Christian. Those two things probably should work together. I probably should have some
Yeah.
kind of coherent worldview. That was important to me to be consistent in my thinking. And maybe this is just because I'm a nerd, but that was
Well,
important to me.
I think if you have an inconsistent thought, like that leads to trouble down the road, and unfortunately for most people, it ends up being rejecting God.
Yeah,
It's been my experience.
that's true. So for me, the one of the big kind of dichotomies, I guess, things that are contradictory, was that in one sense, I very much believe that we need to do what Jesus teaches us to do. So I take the Sermon on the Mount very seriously. Some people want to spiritualize it. No, I really think that Jesus meant turn the other cheek. I really do think Jesus meant, or Jesus didn't say this, but reflected through Paul, love your enemies. I think that stuff's important. And then here I am we got to bomb Iran, and then those two things don't work together. So I started trying to reconcile and figure that out. And obviously, I decided I probably better follow the way of Jesus. But as I started doing that, I guess for me, and here's where I think maybe you're driving at with the question: how can you be an anarchist? Basically, you're saying I rule myself, and at the same time say God is king, because those two things don't seem to mix. Because basically, you're saying God rules you, which is Godarchy. That's
Right.
where that comes from. How do I fit those two things together? And that's why I like the term voluntarist better than anarchist. Voluntarist implies that I make the decisions about who I'm going to interact with. So the whole idea of voluntarism is that all interactions should be peaceful and not coerced. If you and I are going to interact, it should be on terms that we both agree to, not you pointing a gun at me saying I'm going to do something or vice versa, right?
Right.
It's basic kindergarten.
Yeah.
And as you think about it, that really is what the whole idea of love your neighbor as yourself is getting at, right? You have a certain way that you want to be treated. You should treat other people in the same way. That implies this consensual, voluntary interaction. And so then I started thinking about, how does God interact with us? And this is going to get me in trouble probably with some of my Reformed brethren.
Oh, I hope so.
But from a theological standpoint, I didn't realize there was a word for this until like probably a month or so ago, and I found a book. I'm basically what is known as a Molinist. I believe in the absolute sovereignty of God, but I also believe that we have free will.
Yeah, I've heard, it's funny. I came across that term with, I was listening to some William Lane Craig, and he was talking about this idea, and it was really fascinating stuff.
Yeah. So it's really an attempt to reconcile sovereignty and human will. And I think it does a good job, because I think when you read the Bible, it's really hard to get away from the idea of, and I know that people that are real hardcore into the predestination and stuff, they can probably argue circles around me, because I'm not a theologian. But to me, when you see things like a command to do something, that implies the ability to respond one way or the other. That's just me. So that's kind of where I'm coming from a theological standpoint. And so how does God interact with us?
And I'm sorry, just because I came across the term, but maybe just for our listeners, can you make that Molinism, like why is that different from like the idea of free will, or the sovereignty of God? How does that match those two together?
So I'm still reading the book.
Right on.
I don't know that I can. I'm not at the point where I can put it in simple terms, but
okay, fair enough.
The idea is that, okay, so if you have when you focus completely on God's sovereignty, the idea is that God is controlling everything. So if God is controlling everything, ergo you have no control over your own will, because God's controlling everything. That's the free will.
Well, that's what, wouldn't that be what like Muslims would say too? Like God willing, like hey,
probably
I am not in charge of anything, right?
Right.
Allah is
from the kind of, I guess Armenian is the term that's often used for what the strain that you see in Methodism that emphasizes more the human response. And a Calvinist will tell you the human response doesn't matter. God's grace is irresistible. If he's offering it to you, you're going to go there whether you want to or not.
Yeah.
The free will, the Armenians will almost go to the other extreme and basically say, well, God is powerless and our actions really determine everything. And it kind of diminishes, I think, what is clearly taught, that God is sovereign.
Right.
Molinism attempts to reconcile those two positions, to uphold God's sovereignty, that he knows all, sees all, and at the same time, respect the choices of human will. And it's actually it's a little bit complicated, because they kind of split God's will into three parts, and
okay.
Part of it is that he knows everything that is going to happen, and he knows so if you're given a choice, let's say there's 3 alternatives that you can take. God, in his omniscience, in his omnipotence, omniscience, I guess is the right word, he can see if I make choice A, he can see how that would play out.
Yeah.
If I make choice B, he can see how that would play out. If I make choice C, he can see how that would play out. He knows every choice that would, he can see all. And so therefore he works his will, and because he has calculated every possible decision that every human being that's ever existed could ever make, and he has woven that into his will. It's something that really our heads, I don't think, can grasp.
No, but to me that makes sense from a standpoint. I've always felt in my worldview, and again, I'm, as Jim would say, I'm I'm an amateur at the Bible.
Right.
But I've always felt the idea that just because God knows what I'm going to do doesn't take away from the aspect of my choice.
Exactly.
Like I still can choose. He just knows what choice I'm going to make.
And then he takes that and he weaves it in with all of the other choices that everybody else is making. And he has created a world such that the ultimate outcome is going to be his will, despite all of our own wills going on. And I think, to get a little bit metaphysical, I think a lot of our inability to grasp this comes with the fact that we are locked into time. We live life in this linear thing called time. We have a past, we have a present, we have a future. God's not limited by time. We know that because he's above and beyond it. He created this whole idea of time. And it's almost like, the way I try to imagine it is if God is if you're playing a board game and you can sit above the board game and you can see every piece on the board and how it's moving, God sees the universe like that. In a sense, in God's perception, it's all happening, quote unquote, at the same time.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
He's not, it's not like he's surprised by tomorrow, because tomorrow already exists for him.
You're right. It's tangible for him right now.
Yeah. So the bottom line, I mean, we could, and I'm sure there's people out there screaming at me and they can throw Bible verses at me, but
please leave your comments in we'd love to see it.
The important thing to me is that, yes, I believe that God is sovereign, but I also believe that you can't read the Bible without there being an element of human will and human choice. And so that flows over into my political worldview. And this is actually very Lockean. People are probably familiar with John Locke. He was very influential on the founding fathers. Probably the most influential political thinker, that and a guy named, I can't think of his name now. There's another guy that was kind of in the same camp, but
there's Cato's letters. I mean, I've had our mutual friend Joe Wolverton on a few times,
right?
And he'll let us know what all those people are.
Yeah. But Locke was a theologian.
Yeah.
And if you read most people are most familiar with his second treatise on government, where he talks about the consent of the governed and how people are in a state of nature, and then they choose to voluntarily move out of that and have government for their benefit, blah, blah, blah. Most people don't talk about the first treatise, which is where he establishes this whole idea that nobody has an inherent right to rule over another person. And it's very much steeped in theology. And basically the idea is that we're all created by God. We're all created the same. We're not created different. God didn't create one to be above another. He created us all in this. So you see that in the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. That's a Lockean concept. And so Locke was, and he wrote about this. It also comes out in his letters on toleration, which was his argument for basically the separation of church and state. And I encourage everybody to read it. It's not terribly long and it's not too dense. But his argument is that God doesn't force us to follow him. Therefore, no magistrate has any inherent right to force us to have a stake in a church. So that's where he got this whole idea of toleration. It was the idea that God doesn't compel us. He doesn't use armies to bring us into his kingdom. He sends his son and we respond to that. And so that's why I'm a voluntarist. To bring it back full circle. I believe that the whole Lockean idea that I'm not created to be a ruler over you. You're not created to be a ruler over me. Therefore, any ethical, just interaction between us must be consensual and voluntary. And we can, this is where I lose the anarchist. We can choose to put ourselves in subjection to other people. So for me as a voluntarist, I don't reject hierarchy. I don't reject even the idea of government in the abstract. In effect, when I join a church, I am placing myself under the authority of that pastor. I am voluntarily determining that I'm going to support this institution with my time, my gifts, my money.
Right.
But I can leave anytime I want to. It's a voluntary interaction. It's a voluntary government. But while I am in there, I am submitting myself to the leadership of the church.
Their rules, their plan, their
Exactly.
vision.
You can do
all
that
of
in
that be
anything.
absolutely.
If you want a job and I need work to be done, you can say, "Hey, Mike, I can teach piano." And I've got some people I need piano taught to. I'll pay you X number of dollars. That's a voluntary transaction. You have, in a sense, put yourself in subjection to me because I'm your boss now.
Right.
I tell you what time you need to teach the piano lessons and how many hours you need to spend on teaching piano lessons and in return. But it's voluntary because you can leave. So
That's
I
right.
don't reject government. I don't reject hierarchy. I reject coercive, forced hierarchy, which is what the state is. The state won't let me leave.
Yeah.
The state won't let me not pay my taxes.
Yep.
And people, the people like that to play if you don't like government, go to Somalia. Well, first off, that's a whole different ball of wax because Somalia actually did pretty well without the state in its stateless period. But aside from that, I can't go to Somalia because the IRS is still going to take a chunk of my money out of my back pocket.
That's
So,
right.
And that's my issue with the state. It is based on violence, force, and coercion. It goes back to what William Stringfellow said. It is the moral authority of the state is death, and the moral authority of Jesus is life. So those two things don't work together.
That's right. Oh, and because no man can serve two masters, and because choose ye this day. I mean, it is our choice. How what is going to be supreme in our lives,
Right.
And I think that becomes a real problem for people when things like the Pledge of Allegiance, like who are we pledging to, like what does that mean versus what's going to be secondary to that.
Right. Exactly.
Things like that.
Yeah. And so obviously somebody out there right now is listening is going Romans 13. So I guess we probably ought to address the Romans 13 in the room.
We probably should.
I am not advocating for violent rebellion or violent overthrow of the government because, again, Jesus told me to put away my sword. It's a different kingdom. It's based on different ethics and a different way of doing things. So how can I be anti-government in light of Romans 13? Well, in the same way that the early church was anti-government in the face of, I don't know if Romans 13 really kind of existed for them. I mean, I'm sure it had been written, but who knows how widely spread it was at that point. But they did not rebel against Rome. You never hear about the church, going out and having a riot, right?
Right.
Their rebellion was, we are not going to do the things that are counter to what our God is telling us. For many, it was, we are not going to serve in the Roman army. We're not going to offer sacrifices in the Roman temple. And when push came to shove, they were willing to die for that. That's the whole story of the persecutions during the Roman era, is that the Christians would not submit, and yet they wouldn't rebel. They went to their death. And that's how I see that whole idea of submission in Romans 13. It's submission, but it's not doing whatever you're told to do.
Well,
It's
that goes back to what Christ said when he said, "Render to Caesar's that which is Caesar's."
right.
In other words, you know, I this body belongs to this earth. This living, this tissue, this this sand that was molded into a body, belongs to this earth. But what you can't take is my heart, and I've given my heart to God. So render to Caesar. I'm gonna render. I'm not going to render my heart to Caesar because it's God's.
Yeah. That's very profound. And I think you're exactly right. I like the example in terms of how a Christian should interact with the state. My example I often use is Rosa Parks. And we all know this story. She was on the bus, and she's supposed to go sit in the back of the bus, and she didn't do it because she recognized it as an unjust, immoral law. But when she was told that she needed to go to the back of the bus, she sat there, but she didn't tear up the bus. She didn't punch the cop in the face when the cop came to arrest her. She submitted to the authority, and yet she didn't submit to the unjust, immoral law. And so that's kind of the strategy for me as a believer who is anti-government. I'm not going to submit to what it's telling me to do when it's counter to what my Lord and Savior tell me to do, but I'm not going to take up arms and try to overthrow it either.
Right. Right. That's a wonderful perspective. That's really good. So Mike, running a little bit short, man. We got to do this again, man, because I love talking about these ideas because I think they're so important to instill into people. It's like you can. I when I think about a lot about the last words of David. I sang the song "The Last Words of David," which is Psalms. I can't remember which one, but basically he says, "He that ruleth over men must be just."
Mm-hmm.
And if you really read that correctly, I believe there is no man who is just. David proved that.
Yeah,
There is
good.
no man who is just enough to rule,
Yeah.
and except for one, and he's God. And so to submit ourselves to or to have just had to have that recognition that just because somebody got one or two more votes than the next guy does not give them the authority to basically run your life as a king would,
Right. Using a gun. You
using a
always have to
gun.
always remember. I always want people to remember they're using a
That's
gun.
right.
And here's my goal. I'm not trying to convince you that to be a good Christian, you need to be an anarchist. I think you'd be a better Christian as an anarchist, but that's just me. But what I really want to do is I want people to begin to think differently. I want to challenge the paradigms that we've kind of fallen into just out of habit. I want people to take pause when that national anthem is played and to at least stop and think, this is a war song. How
Yeah.
is Jesus, it was remember the bracelets, what would Jesus do? WWJD.
Right.
I want people to stop and think about that. And even if you don't come to the same conclusions as I do, I at least hope that I'm making people consider different perspectives, that maybe they'll be a little slower to cheer on the war machine, that they'll be a little slower to advocate for more taxes because we're going to fix this or that problem, that they'll at least stop and think about, more taxes means somebody pointing a gun at somebody and taking their money. I want people to consider these things. And I hate the analogy, the Overton window, because it's overused, but it's overused because it's a good analogy. I want to shift that window a little bit toward voluntarism, and hopefully over time people will begin to embrace it, because I think it is a beautiful philosophy. Really, what I want is I want peace and human flourishing. right? I mean, that's the best we can hope for in this world is to be a light and to bring a little bit more peace and a little bit more human flourishing into this broken, sinful world. And I believe that the best way to do that is through respecting the people that are around you, truly embracing love your neighbor as yourself. I mean, think about what the world would look like if we truly loved our neighbors in the same way that we loved ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think anybody can say, well, Mike, that's a dumb philosophy and it's just going to make the world a worse place.
Right. Right.
uh, and I can, I sympathize with folks who say, well, Mike, you're utopian. And this can never happen in this world. It's a fallen, sinful world. Yes, it is. But Jesus calls us to be salt and light in this world. So,
but you know what, Mike? I don't think what you're advocating for and what I've been talking about is utopian at all. We recognize the fallen state of man. We recognize, we're not saying that it will solve the problems of being human, but if we're, and I give this example all the time, if we were just to take the 10 commandments seriously, just those 10 things, and we actually lived those 10 commandments, what would the world look like? What would be different about the world? And that's something that everybody can do. And it's not utopian at all. It's just, it's simply like living by 10 laws that God's given us to have a happy life.
yeah. Which all of the ones that relate to our interactions with others, do not kill, do not steal.
Mm-hmm.
Those are all basically just,
Don't envy.
they're property rights,
Yeah.
right? It's respecting the other person's autonomy as a human being. Which again is something that I mean, really, it should be self-evident, right?
Yeah.
You own yourself. Now, I know the scripture, you're God, you were bought with a price. That's true. But in this world, you own yourself. You have control. Bodily autonomy is
Right.
the fancy term.
Because the government didn't buy you.
Yeah, no, that's true. And so I need to respect your autonomy and your choices in the way you live your life. And that means that I don't use violence and force and coercion to make you do something that's against your will. Now, that doesn't preclude using defensive force if you come after me, and we can
Right.
debate the Christian ethics in using force at all. That's a fun discussion. But regardless, I don't have a right to physically impose upon you to do things that I want you to do just because I want you to do them. That includes taking your money for a good cause. That includes making you not take a drug that I disapprove of. That includes forcing you to, arresting you if you decide to go to a prostitute. All of those things are bad. I'm not advocating for those lifestyles, but I'm saying I don't have the right to hit you because you're doing things I disapprove of.
That's right.
It's kindergarten, right? Don't hit people. Don't take their stuff. That's all it is.
Man. I would love, for anybody who listens to this podcast, I would love you if you just take one moment, check out godarchy.org. Check out the Godarchy podcast, see the good work that Mike Maharrey is doing. Of course, check out his work on 10th Amendment Center, as well as Shift Gold and all the other stuff he's doing for the Liberty Movement. But I really think, like this, as he said, this is a passion project for him, and you can really tell in the work that he's doing and the stuff. And what was the name of the Libertarian Christian Institute? Is that the network?
Yeah, Libertarian Christian Institute. It's christianlibertarians.com is the website. And yeah, check them out. I mean, they do. If you want to learn about Romans 13, there's like 500 articles on that website about Romans 13. And there's all the podcasts on the network, but there's just a lot of great resources. You can go in there and you can get sound biblical teaching from some really folks that are a lot smarter and more knowledgeable than I about things like, what about the whole idea of the render unto Caesar? What does that mean? What did it mean when Jesus said, "Put away your sword"? What did it mean when Jesus said, "Go get a sword"? All of these things they dig into these and the social issues. There's stuff on there about abortion and I think in a very thoughtful way. There's a lot of resources there. So if you are a Christian and you are at all interested in limited government, you don't have to be an anarchist. If you're just interested in good old American constitutionalism. I think you'll find a lot of great resources there to help integrate your biblical worldview, your faith with the world of politics.
And we'll definitely put those in the show notes. All right, one last thing to bring this full circle. How are the Lightning going to do this year, man? I already know the Coyotes are going to be terrible. So,
yeah. So it's a good question. It's been interesting watching them this season. I don't know how in the weeds I should get on a podcast about hockey, because I can go way in the weeds.
I know you can.
Hockey is something I know a lot about. I'm not a theological expert. I'm a hockey expert. So I think all teams in the NHL, and this is true of the NFL as well, it's a struggle to stay on top with the salary cap.
Yeah.
And the Lightning have done a really good job over the years of managing that. But obviously you're losing pieces every year. And so your team's different every year. This last offseason, they lost Ryan McDonough. He was their best defensive defenseman. They had to let him go because of salary cap ramifications, but they really, really miss him on the back end. And you can see that in the way that they've been playing. They're still trying to figure out their defense, and they give up way too many goals.
Like I know, like the NBA has a salary cap, but it's kind of a soft cap, and as long as you're willing to pay taxes, you can pretty much have whoever you want on the team that you want. So it's not like that in the NHL.
No, the NHL is a hard cap like the NFL. So your payroll has to stay under a certain amount, and it's really the COVID era really hurt because like the NFL, the formula for the salary cap is based on league revenues, et cetera, et cetera. And so revenues obviously were down because nobody could go to games, and you don't have the TV contracts in the NHL at the same level as you do in the NFL. So it's just not as much money. And a lot of teams have really struggled with this. They signed players to long-term deals with a lot of money, and then they're getting hit on the back end now because the salary cap hasn't gone up, and as people are needing to renew contracts, then you're going to lose guys. That's just the nature of it. But for the Lightning, it's really hurt them the most on their defense. They're still potent offense. I think this is definitely a playoff team. Whether or not they can make a deep run in the playoffs right now, I don't know. It'll be interesting to see. This. It's a work in progress.
Am I right to say like the trading deadline's late enough in the NHL that they can kind of make, if it looks like they're going to have a chance, they can make some additions, or is that still a difficult thing to do in the NHL?
Well, the trade deadline's in March, and you see a lot more trades in the NHL than you do in football.
Yeah,
there'll be a lot of player movement. The problem is, again, you're still up against the salary cap. So if you're going to bring somebody in, you basically got to finagle and make that cap space. So like last year, the Lightning didn't make a whole lot of moves as they went into their playoff run because they didn't have any cap space to bring anybody in. And they felt good with the chemistry. So, but I don't think that they're going to, even when we get to March, unless there's an injury, because obviously if you have somebody that's injured on a long-term injury or out for the season, then you can take them out of the cap equation.
Yeah.
So unless they have an injury or something of that nature, I don't see them being able to like bring in a high-priced defenseman. I think they're pretty much going to have to roll with what they've got. And they've got some good young guys that are, but it's like anything. There's a learning curve,
right? Hopefully
especially
they'll
on the back end in the NHL.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting.
That's a tough place to learn.
And there's some good teams. The Boston Bruins are just freaking on fire right now, which hurts my heart because I don't like them. But they've not lost a home game yet this year.
Oh wow!
And they've only lost I think 3 or 4 games all season, which is they set the record for consecutive wins to open up a season. So
I have no idea what it's like to have a good hockey team.
Yeah. The Coyotes have always kind of struggled a little bit.
Well, they got so many external problems that it's
interesting.
Slips in.
It's interesting. If you if you're really into sports and you follow it long enough, you start to recognize that a lot of times the product especially over the long haul, the product on the field or the ice reflects not just the players and the coaches, but that entire organization. So you see
For
it like the
sure.
Pittsburgh Steelers, consistently good, solid organization from top to
San
bottom.
Antonio Spurs.
Yeah.
I mean, you can, yeah, absolutely.
And then the flip side of it, the Cleveland Browns can't get out of their own way. You
Right.
know?
Or you have a team like the Dodgers that have all the money in the world, and obviously they won the World Series not too long ago, but 9 times out of 10 it's not going to work. Or the Yankees were famous for that, where they'd spend all this money and then the only time they won was when they paid all their homegrown guys to do well.
And I know this from playing sports and even from watching the Lightning, in the NHL. Yeah, your superstars are key to getting you to the playoffs. So in an 80-game season, those superstars are going to impose their will, and they're going to account for a lot of wins. When you get to the playoffs, it's a whole different ball of wax.
Different deal, yeah. It's a different sport.
The teams that win Stanley Cups are the teams that have extremely strong defensive cores and teams that can get scoring from their third and fourth lines. And not because when you get in a playoff situation, both teams, you're playing a series, so you're learning the tendencies. The superstars tend to offset each other. They shut each other down. So it's the teams that have the depth, the scoring depth, that end up winning. And that's really, if you look at the 2 cups the Lightning won, and even last year going into the finals against Colorado, they were getting that scoring from guys like, not the people you expect. They're getting stuff from like Ross Colton and Yanni Gord and people that are like, who? Because it's sports are a beautiful example of synergy. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts.
Yep.
And that's one of the things that makes me optimistic, even this year with the Lightning struggling and getting older, struggling with some of the
and I think
losses.
Hockey more than any other sport, for me, and it's because I didn't grow up in a hockey town. I didn't grow up with hockey, so for me, when I watch hockey, it looks so much more like goals seem a lot more random. They seem a lot more like I'm not saying like I see the skill on the ice and I see what's going on. Don't get me wrong. But like somebody can have a perfectly beautiful shot and still miss. There's a lot of stuff goes off a skate and goes into a goal. A lot of that kind of stuff happens.
We call that puck luck.
Right. And
of course, puck luck goes both ways, because sometimes you don't get the puck luck. So
no, that's right. You can't rely on it, but at the same time, it becomes that synergy becomes so much more important when you're in a sport where it's so fast and it's so I'm not going to say it's disorganized. It's not disorganized at all, but there's a lot going on, and that puck can get lost in a lot of weird spots.
Yeah, it's very difficult for a single player to impose their will on a hockey game. First off, they're only out there. I mean, even your top person as far as minutes is generally playing between 20 and 25 minutes of a game.
Yeah, that's the other part of hockey.
So the game is 60 minutes. So your superstar is only out there at best a third of the time, and it's usually defensemen who are racking up the most ice time, because it's a little
they don't have to go as far, right?
Yeah, exactly. But in a basketball team, one person, they can impose their will on a game. In football, it's all about the quarterback.
Yep.
But hockey is very, very much a team sport, and you can get goalies. Goalies can steal games for sure.
Right.
But by and large, over the course of it, and I think baseball is kind of the same way. It's all about that team and consistency and working the system. That's always what the Lightning's whole MO is. We're going to play this solid defensive system. We're going to make sure that the puck stays out of the dangerous areas. Mm-hmm. And then we're going to build our offense off of that defensive success.
Yeah.
And they work that system. And of course, some games it just doesn't work. You get the the weird puck off the skate and you have a breakdown here or there. It's not going to work every game, but over time, over 84 games, that system is going to, if it's good and if the players are good and buy into the system and work together, more often than not, you're going to win. And then when you get to playoff time, then you're a 7-game series. You got to win 4 games.
Yeah. Then you hope your goalie gets hot and
Yep.
a little bit of puck luck, and you're, like you said, your depth has to play a role. Well, I am going to let you go because, again, we can talk about this for another hour, and I know
most people won't let me talk about hockey, so
well, I'll have you back on. We'll talk. I am interested in hockey. I think because I don't understand it as well. I'm fascinated by it. It's one of those like sports that I think is so cool. And I
get it. It's on ice. It's cool.
It is. See,
there's a lot of, I think, I was a sports editor for a while.
Okay.
That was my first journalism job. I was a sports editor. I've always loved sports. And I love it for the entertainment value, obviously, but there's so many life lessons in sports.
Yeah.
You want to talk about a place where you don't generally see racism or that kind of division. It's in a locker room.
Yeah.
Those guys are your brothers, no matter who they are, no matter where they came from. I remember I played hockey for the University of South Florida as a 39-year-old. So I was 39 and 40 the 2 years that I went back to school.
Oh, no way. How cool.
Yeah. So I'm in the locker room and these guys are all 18, 19, 20. It's like, I've got kids.
Right.
I'm older than the coaches. But yeah, and we had, these guys are all from different parts of the country. They're from different backgrounds. There's guys that are lefties. There's guys that are right wingers. There's guys that don't care about politics at all. We had a black dude on the team. We had a girl that was another goalie. We got along fantastically because it's kind of like what we were talking about with the church.
Yeah.
Everybody's kind of focused on the same goal. Now you can have bad locker rooms too. Don't get me wrong, but by and large, you become brothers. And as little as I had in common with a lot of those guys, I'm now still in contact with several guys that I played with 15 years ago, because we developed those bonds, playing hockey together. And one guy in particular, he ended up being an anarchist too, which is kind of fun.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
That's great, man.
So I love sports. Again, kind of going back to the point is that it teaches a lot of life lessons, and there's a lot of things in hockey that you can talk about the kind of the code that you have in the game, because it is such a dangerous game. It's you're going 20, 30 miles an hour with blades on your feet and sticks in your hands.
Yeah.
And over the years, there's a certain code that I think in a lot of ways has been eroded by. Well, it's a whole different story, but I think those kind of things are interesting. Sociological lessons you can learn in those kind of things.
Would you say? I mean, because I might say this again, being a amateur, I might say that like some of those things have been eroded away culturally in hockey because of the rules that have been put in place that before, like for example. If there was a problem on the ice, that would be taken care of on the ice.
Yes, and that's exactly what I'm getting at.
And now, because now you can't because of again, rules. But it is a good lesson. Unintended consequences.
Yes, you see a lot more dirty stick work. Things that wouldn't have happened back in the 90s, because you had guys that were specifically on the team. They called them enforcers. Their job was, if you did something dirty, you made a run at a star player, you were subject to getting your ass kicked.
Yeah.
Just to be blunt about it. And that policing of the self, policing of the game within the game, I think, in many ways, the game was safer. And there's this whole psychology aspect of kind of the psychological pressure valve that's released when the two enforcers kind of go at it. That's gone. There's a really good video if people are interested in this kind of thing. It's called Ice Guardians. It was on Netflix for a while. I don't know if it's on there or not, but you could probably get it on like Amazon or something. But it's really interesting. It interviews a lot of the guys that came up in that enforcer era. They talked about their job and why it mattered and what it did for the game and why it evolved as part of the game. And it is really interesting. And
that's fascinating. I gotta check that out because that's a great part of hockey that is it's getting phased out if it hasn't already been.
I can tell you right now from experience that as a goalie's pretty vulnerable position in a lot of ways. You're down, you've got your knees flailed out, and you've got people running into you. So as a goalie, I have a vested interest in keeping people away from me. And having had my back blown out because somebody ran into me, makes me particularly sensitive to it. Also, the fact that when I'm down, my head is pretty low on the ice. I don't like getting hit in the head with the stick.
Yeah.
Or if I have the puck in my hand, somebody coming along and slapping my hand with their stick, that hurts.
Right. Or their blade
I have always been very aggressive about if somebody comes into the crease, I will hit them. And sometimes I take penalties, but I can tell you that when you make it clear that you're not going to put up with it, people become a lot more reluctant to do things that are on the edge if they know that there's
when you set your boundaries.
So, this kind of goes contrary to my general pacifism, but ice is different.
Well, there's a good football guy here. He's a good Christian guy. I love it. He says, and he's on the radio, and his name is Ron Wolfley, and he'll say stuff like, when you go between the lines, you got to drive the guy into the ground. And then when you go outside the lines, you love him better than yourself. It's the greatest thing that God's ever given me.
Well, and it's kind of, think about it. This just occurred to me, but it is kind of an example of voluntarism, right?
Right.
When I step out onto the ice, I know that I'm stepping into an environment that has certain rules and a certain code.
And a certain risk.
Certain risks, and I'm voluntarily accepting that I'm going to operate within this world. I don't have to. Somebody's forcing me to do it. So, it's kind of interesting.
That's great.
It's funny because I played professional roller hockey for like 5 minutes back in the 90s.
Okay.
And so to be clear, when I say I played, I made it through the entire training camp. I got cut the night before the first game.
Man.
They did a trade and anyway, but I did sign a contract, so I can technically say that I was a professional athlete. I did ink my signature on it. But anyway, I got to be pretty good friends with the guy that was on the team that was an enforcer. And most of the players in this league it was a summer league. It's roller hockey. A lot of them were minor league hockey players that were trying to stay in shape because they're trying to make it, into the NHL someday. So a lot of guys from East Coast Hockey League and some of those lower pro levels. I got to be real good friends with the guy that was kind of the enforcer. And it was so funny because he was like a teddy bear off the ice and just a one-man wrecking crew. There wasn't ice. It was
on the rink.
But on the rink. Yeah. He was a one-man wrecking crew once he was out there. But you would see him they would go at it with these two guys. They would just be punching and cussing and
Oh man.
And then after the game, you'd see him sitting at the bar having a beer together. It wasn't a personal thing at all. It's just kind of a weird thing,
That's so wild.
Yeah. That goes to show you really do. It's just like the football player guy said, there's a mentality that's expected from both parties. And it's interesting in a hockey fight, generally speaking, even back in the day, you would have situations where now they won't let you instigate at all. But back in the day, if you did something stupid, you might get jumped. But generally speaking, there would be an agreement before the gloves would drop. It's like, you want to go? We're going to go? And you both agree, and you both drop the gloves. And that's the way it works today. It's like, and they'll tell you that in this, I think it was a book I read that was interviewing a bunch of these enforcers, and there was a mutual respect thing. And you might say, "Hey, we're gonna go," and the other guy say, "Hey, man, I got a bad shoulder. I can't go." That's cool. There was that respect.
Dude,
it's really interesting.
That's the gladiator mentality, man.
Yeah, it is. It totally is. It totally
That's
is. It's ice gladiators,
yeah.
um, and that's a cool thing.
Okay, my new band name, Ice Gladiators.
Ice gladiators, yeah. It's that's a kind of a cool thing. You watch hockey playoffs, and one of the cool traditions is these guys have gone at it for up to 7 games and just smashing people into the boards, and then you'll see them at the end of that last game. They do the handshake line, and they're shaking hands, and they're looking each other in the eye, and they're hugging each other, and they're congratulating each other.
That is a great
that
tradition.
Sportsmanship is cool because it's a fraternity thing. I can find hockey players all over the world. We're all kind of the same because we're all from the same game. And really, when you get down to it, there's not that many of us.
Yeah.
So that whole fraternity thing's cool.
So
we got way off the subject here, didn't we?
Oh, hey, that's all right, man. We'll do it again. Especially with your sports background. Well, I would love to talk some more. I love sports. I played sports, and just it's one of my passions. It's something I don't get to really explore as much as I'd like to. So that'd be fun. All right, so go check out Mike Maharrey, godarchy.org. Check out Libertarian Christian Network at libertarianchristians.com. Check out his work with the 10th Amendment Center. And, seriously, this guy's a great thinker. He's a lot of fun, and you're going to like his work. Agree or disagree, you got to respect what he's putting out there. So thank you, Mike, for being on the show.
Well, thank you for having me. I always enjoy it, and it's cool to do. This is my style of show where you just talk about whatever. I think that's right up my alley because I think we covered a lot of cool topics, and I really appreciate the opportunity to share and hang out with you.
Well, hey, it's my pleasure. It's fun. We'll do it again. All right, man?
All righty.
You are listening to And If Love Remains.
The first of 23 installments requested by Dr. Levitt. We're trying to be in compliance here because we're taking him and that whole organization